Headsets are available for translation and for sound amplification. Can members please turn their phones on to silent? In an emergency, follow directions from the ushers. We've received no apologies. Do members have any declarations of interest they'd like to make at this point? No. Okay, item 4. And first of all, we've a couple of papers to note. First of all, the minutes from the meeting held on the 23rd of April. To agree those? Good. Secondly, Andrew Slade has replied to my letter of the 23rd of March regarding the ongoing review into public procurement, and he's provided additional information about overall capacity and capability across the public sector. I shall be referring to these issues during my statement in plenary on Wednesday, I should say. Happy to note that letter, and we will return to this issue in the autumn on the publication of the government's review. Good. And the next item, and can I welcome our witnesses? This is our 9th evidence session, looking at care experienced children and young people. So can I welcome our witnesses from the Welsh Government? Would you like to give your name and position for the record?
Good afternoon. My name is Albert Heaney. I'm the Welsh Government's Director for Social Services and Integration.
My name is Alistair Davey. I'm Deputy Director within Social Services and Integration for the Division of Enabling People.
Great, thanks for being with us today. I'll kick off with the first question. And during the course of our inquiry, the young people we've heard from have told us about the major challenges that they faced as care experienced young people, including having numerous social workers needing to move placements frequently and at short notice, and not being treated with the dignity and respect which they felt that they should have been treated with. In what ways does the Welsh Government take young people's views into account when setting its expectations for services for children in local authority areas?
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the first question. The Welsh Government places at the centre of its work inclusion of the voices and the views of children and young people. The Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act in 2014, implemented in April 2016, actually places enshrines in law duties in relation to including the voices and ensuring that the wishes and feelings and the voices of children and young people are explicitly included in the work of local authorities, and our central approach around the United Nations Convention on Rights of Children has also been embedded within our framework for improving outcomes for children and young people. So absolutely cornerstone. Just a couple of issues that may be helpful for the committee today. Again, in taking that into some actions, we're very pleased that Mr. Dan Pitt, a care leaver himself, is the Vice Chair of the Ministerial Advisory Group. And indeed provides a great critique of the approach of the Welsh Government and others in terms of developing, so brings a reality check to the work that's currently in play, but also puts a significant challenge in. And alongside that, Chair, then there's the whole host involved in the Ministerial Advisory Group work, improving outcomes for children of the third sector. So we have a very strong voice coming forward in terms of the work. You mentioned about the experiences of children about and some of the disruptive factors. So what we're currently doing, we have the Children's Commission was very committed to an approach around bright spots, and the Ministerial Advisory Group is currently has done a survey around bright spots, and that's due, the learning from that is due to be published in June. And again, that's including the voices of children and care experienced children and young people directly in terms of their experiences, so we can use that knowledge directly from themselves in terms of them improvements that we need to take forward. And we do know as a Welsh Government that stability for children in their lives is crucial. And we have, as part of the Ministerial Advisory Group, undertaken a major piece of work around placements, especially for those children and young people who have been in the care system for 4 to 5 years. That particular work has come to conclusion. In terms of timing for the committee, it's actually just due to be published after this committee on the 15th of May. But one of the highlights that's coming out of the report is around about 3/4 of children in the care system have more stability in placement, so not or one placement moves, and that again is something that we want to see embedded throughout the whole of kind of Welsh care.
Just on the issue of placements, because that was a key concern that the young people that this committee spoke to raised, and just to go through some of that evidence, one young person told us I had 14 different placements in a year. Another said I'd been at the placement for 4 or 5 years, and then all of a sudden my social worker turned up on a Friday and was told we'd be moved on a Monday. Another young person told us they had maybe 40 placements over 12 years, so over the 5-year period you spoke about. So this clearly has come up again and again. Are you confident that going forward these issues can be addressed, and that local authorities will be left in no doubt that they really should be putting the younger person at the centre of this process, as you said?
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. I mean, what we've got to do, we've got to acknowledge the fact that some children and young people's experiences just isn't acceptable, and that we've got to work harder and more effectively. I think that brings us into some of the challenges sometimes that children and young people themselves face. And care experience children come from a variety of backgrounds with different experiences. Some of those experiences have been through abuse and neglect, and sadly that has a dramatic impact. So part of the work, the whole focus of the work, is about timely and appropriate interventions, both on a support level, but also on a therapeutic level that can sustain and enable placements to be much more successful. So the platform that we have built and starting to build through the Ministerial Advisory Group really does begin to sharpen our focus across the nation, both working with local authorities, but also some of the expertise coming from our partner organisations such as the third sector.
Yeah. Did you want?
I think as part of that, advocacy services play a key role, because obviously they're listening to the views of young people about getting those placements right and hearing from them about their experiences, and that's all critical in terms of representing the voice and control of the young person.
We just, in the private session prior to this, had Lynn Eagle, chair of the Children and Young People's Committee, and she spoke about the importance of advocacy, and there have been quite a few inquiries over, well, the previous assembly over a number of years, and yet we don't seem to have got to a point where it's right yet. You think that with the establishment of the group in 2016, then there will be a much more focused dealing with the issue of advocacy?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I actually chaired the high-level steering group that led to the work around the national approach for advocacy and the active offer. I think one of the things to start with is that for Wales, Wales can be proud of its approach, although it has had to refine and develop and enhance as we've taken some of the issues forward. But we must look back and remember that it was the Waterhouse report that led to our approach in Wales around advocacy, around safeguarding, ensuring the voices and children's experiences are pivotal and supported. Our advocacy approach in Wales, I think this active offer is really quite a unique position in terms of us taking forward, so that every child who's actually in the looked after system for as we looked after children's system within the local authority care, every child will have an automatic an active offer. We have refined that recently, working together with local authorities and our advocacy providers in Wales, where they will actually be ensuring that the advocacy providers will be directly contacting those children and young people to offer them their services. What we do know, and I think this is really important, because advocacy is and should be a part of our Welsh DNA, but talking to NIAS and Trosgonnell Plant, they have told us that where their work around advocacy, some of the benefits and the cost benefits and the outcomes are that children and young people who are currently receiving those advocacy services understand their rights and entitlements. They also have been involved in the discussions around their care planning to make sure that their views are part and enhanced and part of that discussion. They feel more confident in expressing their views and better supported and engaged with them around their care planning. And through the advocacy providers themselves are able to show and demonstrate that it has a positive impact. And then I come back to the kind of Waterhouse issue where we in Wales can then say that we know that all children looked after have that access, that direct contact with advocacy.
Yeah, it's not just the services being there, it's they've got to
exactly,
be aware
and that
they're
accessibility, and that was one of the challenges that we found previously, was that although advocacy services were there, the actual accessibility didn't always take place in the way that they wanted it to do so for children and young people. And that active offer, turns that around, where it's actually direct. And the safeguarding issues, where children have got a concern or a worry, they have that contact with their advocacy provider and can raise any issues in relation to safeguarding.
Yeah. Did did you want to add?
Just that obviously we've invested a lot of money in the service, £550,000, to get the sort of social services, sort of regional collaboratives up and running. So that has been a big challenge for us, but now that work is well underway, and as Albert was saying, we're getting really positive feedback now that that's really starting to bite, and we're driving that consistency across Wales.
Great. Supplementary from Rhiannon Passmore.
Thank you. In regard to those children that have access, and looked after children should have that access across Wales, and that is a major step forward. In terms of educate children that are in need or are about to become looked after children, do you feel that we've got the balance right in terms, and the ratio right in terms of spend on necessary placements that we currently have the model for across Wales in very disparate animal shapes, if you wished, compared to the access to services that will, if we invest bottom end, and we all know local authorities are struggling in terms of access to services. Do you think that balance is right across Wales? And do we need to have ministerial task force to state that we need to recalibrate this model across Wales?
Who wants to take that?
That one. I think in terms of the Ministerial Advisory Group, one of the work streams that we're now developing is very much around prevention and intervention, because I think you're right, this is about getting the right balance in between very early intervention and prevention, going all the way through to edge of care, because the role of the Ministerial Advisory Group is both looking at preventing children coming into care, improving outcomes for children in care, and improving outcomes for care leavers. So the real focus that we're placing at the moment as we go forward around that value for money is on the prevention and intervention agenda.
In terms of whether we need a ministerial advisory group, actually, I would say that from my perspective, a ministerial advisory group has been absolutely pivotal in this, because at the moment, a lot of the spend gets caught up in terms of the numbers and the system and the costs around the numbers. But if we were to be much more effective about the value, then we have to swing that around in terms of looking sure at the prevention and supporting, because it does cost more for local authorities for children when they're in the care system due to their particular needs.
Do you think at the moment the placement, the cost of placements for looked after children is correct? Do you think it can be remodelled and re-envisaged?
In terms of costs of placement, obviously the committee will have the costs in front of them from the evidence that's been provided. I think it's that issue where when you have children who have very complex needs, is that the earlier the prevention and intervention go in, it can give them a better life course opportunity. So it's about making sure that we do everything that we can do as timely and as effectively. We certainly do see some children, young people with very complex plans that end up with very high level costs of residential care, for example. And I think that that's why the work of the Ministerial Advisory Group, and it's not just the Ministerial Advisory Group, it's the energy around the ownership from the different partner organisations, the heads of children's services at the heart of that, the voluntary sectors at the heart of that, and really beginning to come up with an approach and approaches that can begin to lead us. So if you were looking at, do local authorities have to sometimes pay a very expensive placement? Yes, they do. That has a substantial impact then on their budget and their budget availability. What we're trying to do is begin to establish some of the lever changes that can actually enable them to have, hopefully safely reduce the numbers of looked after children over the period, with much more investment around the earlier intervention.
Heads of service, through the chair, have said that the costs are becoming unsustainable for the near future. So in that regard, do you feel that there is the emphasis in the Ministerial Advisory Group and others to say that is it now the time that we look at perhaps a model across Wales where we can have perhaps a more consistent application of placement needs, so that we can refocus the money on services and on access to mental health care or support services earlier on? Is there any synergy in that view from you both?
I think so. Obviously you're pretty aware of the National Fostering Framework that's very much looking at commissioning and placement costs. We know that it costs almost double for an independent fostering placement as compared to a local authority placement. So we're looking at a national marketing plan, national training, because we've got to look at how do we recruit and better retain our foster carers in Wales. Because obviously there's a big shift there in saving that we can make to reinvest elsewhere. So that's one area that we're looking at. Also, we've just commenced a piece of work under the Residential Care and Task and Finish Group to look at new models of care, looking right across Wales about what's working and wider afield as well, to look at some of the costs that are associated, some of the cost benefits. And I think, as Albert was saying earlier, the earlier you get into that, the more money you're going to save down the line. So you're right. So it's looking at the edge of care, but it's also going right downstream to look at, for example, on Families First and Flying Start, the difference that they're making and how much they're focusing. You know, at present, I think it's about 62% of the children coming into care are coming in because of neglect and abuse. So they're coming in for the right reason, but we need to be going back downstream to make sure that that doesn't happen in the first place.
Lee Waters.
Do you accept the point that Rhiannon put to you that the All Wales Children's Heads of Service has said that the system is becoming rapidly unsustainable and nearing breaking point? Is that a characterisation you acknowledge?
Well, I think we recognise the financial pressure on local authorities, and for that reason I know that we're trying to mitigate against UK-wide austerity. But I think as well, we know in the revenue support grant for 2018-19 we'll distribute 445 million on the children and young persons formula, and the looked after children actual spend over the same period has increased by 15%, from 223 million in 2012-13 to 256 million. So that investment is there, but it's how that investment is used and how, because obviously one of the comments, obviously the heads of children's services are actively involved in the ministerial advisory group. What they're trying to say is how do we shift that spend downstream, because the money is being spent on children in care, so how can they be helped then to put that money in the prevention and intervention, which is why we're looking at how do we better target those programmes, and the flexible funding approach is one way of doing that in terms of having a single approach maybe in the future. I think government are considering that.
Do you accept it's nearing breaking point, or is that hyperbole?
Well, I met with the directors of social services. I would say a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in that meeting we had this very discussion, and there was certainly a variation in the different positions that different local authorities are in. So I think that's something to acknowledge. The acknowledgement today, as a senior official working for Welsh Government, I think this is one of the most critical issues facing us. It is a real pressure point for local authority social services. It's also about making sure we can improve outcomes. So I think there are real pressures in local authorities. I think, as Alistair quite correctly says, the emphasis that we're working upon is leading through ministerial advisory group work is creating the opportunities to kind of break the cycle of children coming into care. There's some really good work beginning to take place in Wales. And that's come from the discussions that we've had around the table. And for example, I would cite the Reflect initiative in Wales, where mothers with potential rubbing up against the wrong, let me get my words correct, Chair. Some mothers frequently have their children removed because of circumstances, and the aim of the scheme is to support them and break that cycle. That cycle is both detrimental to them as a person, it has a dramatic impact, but also it has a dramatic impact on the children and young people coming into the system. In my career, certainly, I've worked with families where 9 children have been into the care system, and that brings all sorts of challenges in its own right. What we're trying to do then is to look at ways in which we can use new models of care that are tested, that enable us to begin to turn that around.
Sure, that'll take time,
improve
clearly.
outcomes, of course.
And the Ministerial Advisory Group agenda is very full, but it's going to take a long time to work some of those things through. Back to the meeting you had recently with the Director of Social Services, you rightly said that clearly there's a variation within the local authorities. Of those you acknowledge who are really struggling, the phrase that they've used is breaking point. What does breaking point look like, and what will the consequences be? What will that mean for the system if some local authorities go beyond the breaking point?
Well, it's not for me to, in a sense, try to define their breaking point, because they have statutory duties placed upon them.
But isn't there not contingency planning taking place of how the Welsh Government's going to step in if it reaches breaking point?
In terms of what the Welsh Government's doing, is trying to look proactively. It's trying to work together with those heads of children's services and directors of social services in a constructive way to get the right approach moving forward. We've mentioned around the different models of care. We've mentioned around different interventions. Some of those interventions are currently live. So I think to say that it's just about us thinking about the future, the Reflect project, as I mentioned, been actively implemented across Wales, was initially trialled over piloted in the Gwent area, and has been successfully rolled out by the Welsh Government funding across Wales. So again, it isn't waiting to the future until the system, in a sense, has all the edges and cracks. It's actually then being much more productive and working with the partners.
Okay.
And remember that the statutory directors of social services and their local authorities, they have together got those duties placed upon them.
Sorry, forgive me, I'm just trying to get a picture in my head of what happens when the local authority hits what they define as breaking point.
Well, from my experience, the local authorities then have detailed plans. We as Welsh Government have asked all of the regional partnership boards to come together to assess their population needs, which include children and planning, and actually then to produce their area plans. The area plans now, 6 of the 7 area plans have been publicised, and it's within their duties to, respond to their population need. What we're doing then as a Welsh Government is supporting, is enabling, is showing that national leadership. And again, the work of the ministers, the Ministerial Advisory Group for Improving Outcomes is highly detailed. Mr Melding is chairing that work and beginning to lead to different opportunities, which should, in the worry about the breaking point, should begin to, alleviate some of those tensions.
And do those area plans include contingency planning for if they do reach what they call breaking point?
I don't think they include in the terms of this is our contingency planning, but it includes their effective planning for how they're going to respond to the population need.
Okay, it's meant to be a fairly straightforward question. I realise it's an incredibly complex area. I'm just taking them at the word of what they say. There's some of them are saying they are close to crisis. And I know this is not, this is an overused word within the public sector, but let's take them at face value. They're close to crisis. You acknowledge some of them are close to breaking point. I'm just trying to get a picture of what happens when they hit that. Because what you're telling me about was respect is longer term plans in place. Does the Welsh Government need to step in at some point and say, this is out of control? What's the contingency planning at your level, given that these warning signals are being sounded?
In terms of the contingency planning, it's for each local authority, their leadership, their statutory director to have effective plans in place about how they respond to the needs of their children and young people. What we're doing as Welsh Government then is supporting them. That was shown through the 8 million funding that had gone in the past year to assist them around children's services, some of the pressures, particularly targeting that funding around edge of care and those pressure points that you quite rightly highlight today. We acknowledge the challenges and the tensions in the system, we understand that. But as a Welsh Government then, we've raised children's issues to the very highest level. Our Prosperity for All, our national strategy.
Are you checking these contingency plans to make sure that they're fit for purpose?
We haven't asked, just to be clear, to clarify, we haven't asked local authorities at this stage to provide us their contingency plans. What we are involved is their planning, their area plans, and constructively working together with the local authorities about how they respond to their statutory duties.
You're satisfied they've got it under control, yeah? Forgive me if I can just interrupt you because I'm not getting the clarity I'm after. Are you satisfied they've got it under control?
We have the Care Inspectorate Wales, who inspect the children's social services, where issues are raised of...
Sorry, Mr Heaney, that's not the answer to my question. I'm really not trying to be difficult.
No, and I'm really trying genuinely to respond.
So we're both trying to be constructive. So you're saying it's not your job to have the detailed plan, that's their job, but you have an oversight function. Are you satisfied that the plans they have are fit for purpose if, as they're warning us, they hit breaking point?
At this moment in time, today, I am satisfied with the information I have in front of me that Children's Services and Social Services Directors are responding positively to the challenges that are currently experiencing. I'm also confident that we together, as Welsh Government, local authorities and other agencies, can, by taking the right actions going forward, ensure that we don't reach this critical breaking point that you're responding to. Because, again, it's in no one's interest, no child, young person's interest.
I think
that does answer my question. Thank you.
Did you want to come in as well?
Yes, sorry. And also we asked local authorities to look at their wider corporate parenting responsibilities, because this is about, in terms of care leavers, for example, they're 6 times more likely to have their children taken into care. So how are they making sure that their budgets around housing and education support their corporate parenting functions? This is wider than just children's services. Is how are they working as a local authority, as the corporate parent, to ensure successful outcomes for those children and young people?
You mentioned £80 million being earmarked. That's now been transferred into the revenue support grant, which obviously is unhypothecated. Local authorities can do what they like with that. They don't have to spend that looked after children. Are you tracking that? And has a child's rights impact assessment been undertaken in respect to that decision?
Yes, we are tracking that. We're expecting feedback very shortly from local authorities. And obviously we gave them a first-year allocation on a grant basis because we wanted to make sure that we had set clear expectations about how they spent that money. And obviously, as part of strategic budgeting and planning, a strategic impact assessment, was conducted.
The child's right impact?
That would form part of that.
Right, and what did that show up?
That showed that there was not an issue.
Right. And has that been tested with the sector?
That would have been published as part of the draft budget.
Have you encouraged scrutiny of that judgment?
We would have expected local authorities to look at that.
Good. And have they fed back to say they're content with that assessment?
We've not heard of any discontent with that.
Okay. And just final question for me. You've just mentioned the variation. We've been seeing the figures in a different spend on average per looked after child, with a huge variation between Cardiff on the one hand and Denbighshire on the other hand. Why is it you think there is that wide variation between different local authorities?
I think, and we've worked very closely with the local authorities. They experience different issues around the demographics, so different population need. There are different issues in relation to the complexity of cases that they sometimes face. Those can be movements between authorities, they can be the size of families. Some of the complexity around drug and alcohol, substance misuse, really quite difficult issues. So in terms of the variation, what we have seen is that some authorities have worked really, really well to integrate kind of services to bring together. That seems to be more effective when they bring partnership working to respond. But it's very difficult, even with the analysis that takes place for the committee, that it isn't necessarily that one authority is performing well or worse, depending on the kind of spend per head, because it can be that sometimes the uniqueness of some of those issues.
Sure, but many of those issues, for example, I was looking at Wrexham,
yes,
which has seen a decrease of 30% in the last 5 years. And I think they've been in touch with the committee to say that figure really doesn't reflect the complexity of the changes they're doing and whether or not it's captured in the right way. But many of the reasons you gave for explaining some of the variation would apply to somewhere like Wrexham in terms of deprivation and so on, and yet they've had a 30% fall in spending. That does seem curious.
Yeah, indeed, and this is part of what we're trying to do through the Ministerial Advisory Group work, to understand that in more detail in terms of then assisting local authorities working together about the types of approaches that they take. Because I think for sometimes the issue of child safety means that what we wouldn't want to do, and I think that's probably one of the most crucial messages to bring across. We don't want local authorities not to safely look after children where they're required to be looked after. But we do want to work together with local authorities to see where we can learn from each other and see how we can ensure the right models of care or delivering the better value for money, the better outcomes for children, young people and their families.
It's just this has occurred over 5 years, and the Ministerial Advisory Group's been going for the last 2. So why the lag?
Well, I don't think there's been a lag. I think the Ministerial Advisory Group is dealing with a number of issues. As we said earlier, it's looking at prevention and intervention. It's also looking at... But
if you're just saying you don't understand why this variation is, this is not a sudden realisation there's been. Why has that not been investigated before now?
We have investigated this. We've looked at, I think Cordis Bright did some work for us probably 3 or 4 years ago. There's no single, silver bullet for this or no explanation. It can come down to individual authorities. It can come down to, do they have a plan for managing looked after children? What is their strategy? About how do they share information? About their workforce, their capacity and capability. There are a whole raft of factors here that we have looked into, and there's no one single reason. So part of this is working with heads of children's services to look at what is working and how do we replicate that across Wales. We want that information to come back from the £5 million on the edge of care, and we're looking at new models, and we're looking across the UK as well about what's really working and what's making a difference.
So finally for me then, would you say has there been a failure to spread best practice over a number of years and to address these things which have been known to you for some time?
I think you always have issues about best practice being spread or not spread, and I think part of this is making sure we know what's working and the circumstances around that, because sometimes it can come down to the people involved, the maturity and the particular issues they're dealing with. So it's a difficult answer there, difficult question to answer, because we've got to understand the particularly unique circumstances in some local authorities. So there is a comparison that we are doing, and obviously the feedback that we get on the edge of care models now will be really important for us going forward to look at what is working out there, and more importantly, why.
You mentioned edge of care, and that's the next area we want to go and discuss, and I realise time's moving on. Neil Hamilton, do you have a quick supplementary first?
One question following on from what Lee Waters has just said about variations in spend around local authorities. Looking at the figures, and I suppose it's pretty obvious really that the urban areas generally tend to have more looked after children per head of population than rural areas. And ignoring the outliers, Cardiff being the most expensive at £64,000 per head, and Denbighshire, I think, at the bottom end of the table, less than half that, 27,000. If you look at an authority like Torfaen, for instance, which has the highest proportion of children in care per 10,000 of population at 166, and that's about 360 altogether, which is half as many as the whole of Cardiff has. They are way down the table in terms of cost per child at £37,000 per annum. Although I take your point that you can't generalise in these cases because the needs of children vary enormously, and it is inevitably a very cost-intensive need that we're trying to address here. It seems to me that if an authority like Torfaen has a large number of looked-after children and has a the largest of all percentage of looked-after children per 10,000 people, there may be some lessons to learn of the way they are doing things, and other authorities may have elements of that as well. And has nothing been done hitherto to look at the problem in this way, to see whether there's anything that we can learn which is valuable from this process?
Two things I would say. One is that heads of children's services frequently and regularly have meetings and conversations to look at what they can share and learn from each other. So I think that's very important. I do think that the Ministerial Advisory Group now has developed it's always one of those challenges when you set up a new group to then begin to move forward. And I think that where it's reached in this now, it's the maturity of the Ministerial Advisory Group that gives us that pivotal moment to be able to do that analysis. And again, as part of his work plan, is to really shift into that learning and more detailed work now around prevention and earlier intervention to begin to assist in terms of both the value for money in terms of cost, but also the benefits then in terms of outcomes and improving outcomes for children.
Thank you.
Just on the subject, you mentioned the individual child's rights impact assessment on the decision to move funding into the RSG. Is it possible for us to have a copy of that assessment as a committee?
You need to be clear on what you're saying, Alistair.
Yes, that was part of what was published as part of the budget in terms of the strategic assessment, impact assessment. In terms of the transfer into the RSG, that would have been an operational consideration, and as such, because there was not a policy change or change in circumstance, no such impact assessment would have been required.
So the
At
impact
the
assessment is
transfer-
purely
at the
on
transfer
the,
stage.
At the
Yes.
transfer
the budget as a...
Yes. At the budget stage, yes, but at the transfer stage, because of no change of policy, then it was not a requirement at that time.
What sort of requirement would there have been at that point, or would that purely have been a operational matter without any...
Purely an operational matter. The agreement between the Welsh Government and the Welsh Local Government Association is to reduce the burden of grants, turning them into then moving into the RSG, and again, it's followed that particular route. As you have quite rightly outlined today, the pressures and the issues around social care, and especially for children, is really important then that the priorities are met in terms of that investment.
Okay, Vicky Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I've got some more questions around educational services. I think, they're very important, but can be quite difficult to measure progress in that area by the very nature of how disparate the interventions necessarily are. So I noticed that the Welsh Government's papers state that £5 million additional funding has been provided to local authorities, and that could prevent around 300 children entering the care system annually. I was wondering what's the basis for that kind of estimate?
Certainly, the estimate was, as you say, was developed building on our experiences of interventions and outcomes, primarily seen through integrated family support services, where I think, for example, in 15-16, around 350 children were engaged by teams. That was effectively costing about 4.5 million. So a similar comparison was done there, and that equates to about a dozen children each local authority, and we thought that was a very realistic figure in year one for them to tilt at. And obviously, we're asking them to come back to us on the models that they're using. What are they reinforcing? What might be new to give us a better idea about what is working in their local authority as part of then sharing that information amongst others. And obviously, different local authorities are in different places and might be using different models. So there's some complexity to this that we need to sift through as well with them, and that will be one of the roles of the Ministerial Advisory Group.
So would you say there's a shift currently where the Welsh Government is shifting more of its expenditure to prevent children going into care?
Yes, I think that's right. In terms of, obviously, we've got the flexible funding approach, which has been sort of piloted in 7 local authorities, which is looking at the consideration to an early intervention and support grant. We've got money spent on Families First and Flying Start. And as Albert pointed out earlier, there's the money, the 8 million that we're now after current funding for edge of care services. But also in terms of prevention and intervention, we've got to look at the end as well, because obviously things like the St David's Fund are supporting care leavers coming out. So ensuring that we sort of increase the number of decrease the number not in employment, education or training, because obviously of that 6 times more likely to have their children taken into care. We've got to look at all parts of the system here about how it reinforces prevention and intervention.
So how do we know if we put in the right amount of money in? I mean, if we put in an extra few million, could we prevent even more children from going into care?
I think there is obviously some logic around that, but it's about how wisely you spend the money, about value for money in the first place, looking at placement stabilities. It's not always about spending more money, it's about how are you using the money that you've got more smartly. For example, as I said earlier, I think maybe if we could have more local authority fostering placements than independent, with the savings there, you can reinvest. So part of this is being clever about how you move the money around and how you invest that. And sometimes it can be very small sums of money. I think we're helping about 400 children and young people with the St David's Fund. And sometimes that's a few £100s. It might be for driving lessons, it might be for tools, but it's really helping to change a child's and young person's life. So it's not always about big sums of money, it's about how do we target small sums of money and spend that money wisely.
So is edge of care services the area where longer term financial savings and improved outcomes could be achieved, or is it just part of the jigsaw then, based on what you've said?
I would say it's part of, I think we're talking about early intervention and prevention all the way back through some of our family support programs and positive parenting. We know that in terms of children being taken into care, about 50% are coming from parents with drug and alcohol problems. So there's an holistic part here that we've got to think about, is how are we supporting those parents in the first place. We've got to think about how do we bolster edge of care to ensure that children don't go into care. How do we do more for the outcomes of children in care in terms of better educational attainment, better supported housing, so that as care leavers, they have a better future and they're not fueling back in. So it is a complex system, but I think it's one that you have to take as a whole.
Thank you.
Great. Mohammed Asker.
Very much indeed, Chair.
I think part of my question has already been answered for placements cost, but I got a couple of other questions to ask the panel, if you can give me the answer. Could you tell us how many children are waiting for fostering in Wales, please? How many children are waiting for fostering in Wales?
What we could do, Chair, if it's helpful, in terms of waiting for fostering, obviously if a child needs to be accommodated into the care of the local authority will take the action required. So I'm not aware of that sense of a waiting list. Perhaps it's if we could have just make sure we can provide any information after this meeting in terms of the clarity. We'll be very happy to do so.
Yeah. Thank you. My question to relate to this directly is because most of the people are putting off, good families are putting off not to have children for fostering because high-profile cases in the court very recently. Have you done anything about this? Now let people know that the fostering is a good job, to look after the child is a noble job. So what government is doing here? I think you're shouting on the wrong tree.
Yes, and thank you very much for that question. We have the national framework around fostering. That's been a major piece of work done together with our partner organisations. It really has promoted a number of streams and work streams to enhance the offer around foster care and also ensuring that we develop foster carers coming into our services and are able to provide. Alistair, I'm sure, will want to add a little bit of detail.
No, sure. We're just in the process of sort of scoping out a national marketing strategy, but you've probably seen recently across Cardiff and across Wales campaigns for foster carers. You know, we're really actively driving at that. Not just about attracting foster carers, but explaining what does foster care mean and sort of people that can foster care, because sometimes there's some very mixed messages, so we want to break them down. And also about how we retain foster carers and the support, and the new national training package will also be coming out shortly. So this is about having an approach where we're really trying to increase the number of local authority foster carers, both, as I was saying earlier, around the cost benefit of that, but also to really demonstrate what a fantastic job it is to be a foster carer.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Reflect project has been operating in Gwent for over a year at this point. And there's a process of being rolled out to all 7 Welsh regions. Has the Welsh government evaluated the success of the project in Gwent with respect to rehabilitation? Is the project objective to eventually see parents who have experienced a compulsory removal of their children reunited with their children and family, or is rehabilitation focused solely upon supporting the adults?
Okay. So the Gwent initiative, the evaluation around the Gwent work is very positive. Indeed, it's worth acknowledging at the committee that the PAUSE project in England preceded this learning and was then transported in terms of taking that knowledge and learning into our approach. The rollout across Wales has occurred. Indeed, 88 parents have been supported through the scheme to date, which is showing the size of the issue in the sport. One of the things I think is really important here is that it's making decisions, good decisions for children, so keeping children safe, but equally also with supporting the parent and giving them a different offer that they weren't getting previously. For some parents, it may be that through the work and intervention, it will lead to them being able to be successful parents with their children. And we would all want that to be the case. For some parents, it will also lead to a situation where their children will need to be supported and cared for by local authorities. And again, we want to make sure that intervention is in place. One of the learning from the work that's been done to date, which I think is heartening, is actually for the mums. It's actually been sometimes the first time they've really been able to look at their issues and themselves and their own self-worth and their self-esteem and their confidence. So there's been a real bonus in terms of the ability to actually enable and the focus upon them, not just focusing on safeguarding, but for them as a person as well. I think that again is a real positive outcome in terms of then giving them life chances and opportunities to have success going forward.
Thank you, Chair.
I went down, just to build on that might be helpful, I went down to the Gwent project with the previous minister a few months back, and I think one of the real issues is working with mothers to understand the reasons why their children was taken into care in the first place. I think sometimes, and this was the feedback from the social workers and others we were working with, the focus of the individual is very much, I just want to be reunited with my child, and it's not about that. The first step is understanding why the child, and to change the circumstances and to help that individual with therapeutic support, so that in terms of any future children they might have, but also in terms of any sort of reunification that might take place with their children. But I think the primary focus when I went along was very much, as Albert was pointing out, was about supporting the mother, getting them to understand, because that is the first step in that journey of being reunited or keeping children in the future.
Thank you very much. And finally, for the sake of value for money and good practice, are you involved with other devolved nations, Scotland, Northern England, learn something from them or teach them something?
Yeah, certainly committee. Our discussions are frequently with our UK partners and beyond. Indeed, we've referenced the Refract project in Wales commenced life as a pause project in England, so taking that learning across. And indeed, the week before last, I was up meeting with the Scottish Government in terms of their approach across children, young people and families as well. So again, we're very much in that process of learning and taking that learning forward in the Welsh context.
And another example might be the Scottish Government has introduced legislation around independent fostering agencies operating on a not-for-profit basis, and I think that's something that we would really like to closely examine to see how that operates.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
And Passmore.
In regard to placements of children that are being fostered and looked after, either a short-term emergency or wider to that, how would you address some of the concerns that have been raised with me, particularly in my constituency, around support and getting that support so that it's intensive enough, so that where a placement breaks down, and there's an awful lot of good work I know going out there at the moment, but in terms of those placements breaking down, often the reason is, well, I didn't get enough social worker time, or I did not get enough of this or enough of that. And those are very simple mechanisms to put in place. And bearing in mind that local government at the moment is coping with statutory services, but we'll say that the time isn't there to be able to do more. And how would you address that as an issue?
I think we know one of the things that some of the conversations that we have with heads of children's services are very much around that contingency planning, making sure they get in a very early stage. We spoke earlier about advocacy, so making sure we understand the needs and wishes of the child. Obviously, you've got to balance that with their best interest as well. So I think it's very much a process where we would want to work with the local authorities, with the heads of children's services, and get their feel around their workforce capacity and capability and their skills about how they support, particularly because the cost of placements is so high that this is about cost avoidance. So making sure that they're putting the right resources into their workforce to ensure that doesn't happen.
And one of the things that we are doing, which is really important, responding to the member's question, so thank you for that question. The issue is around that some of those children end up in residential care. So one of the work streams that we currently have on the Ministerial Advisory Group is specifically look at the residential care needs. And that gets us into then the type and provision that we have in Wales. Do we have the right level? Do we have the therapeutic support, which isn't just what a social worker should do, it's the type of support that goes in around that child and young person. So where children sometimes move through and escalate in terms of concerns, it is looking at the models in terms of our residential provision. So that work is active at the moment in one of the working groups of the Ministerial Advisory Group. So we would very much look forward to coming back and talking in that in a bit more detail.
I think it would be very interesting in terms of also that collaboration with health in regard to that corporate parenting angle, because we know that our budgets are fixed and we know that we have to work within those limitations, either whether it's statutory responsibilities and finance. But in regard to recalibrating that, it seems to me something that needs to be looked at a high level.
We'd also expect there to be a key role, and there's a key role for independent reviewing officers within local authorities, and we're setting new standards and been working with them to ensure their role is sufficiently professionalised, that they're really working with social workers, and that they're really providing challenge in the system there and feeding back to service managers if they feel that that rigour isn't there. So we would see that, you know, as key grit within the system to make sure that things are happening.
Neil Hampton.
To ask a question about care, looked after children's experience in education, and evidence provided by Estin to the Children and Young Persons Committee of the Assembly showed that in 2016 the fixed-term exclusion rate for looked after children was 201 per 1,000. Compared with only 32 per 1,000 for all pupils. Clearly the disparity is huge. One can well understand why children with the disturbed background that they have behavioural problems and so much give rise to this. But have you had any discussions with the Department for Education regarding addressing this substantial difference and therefore improving outcomes?
Thank you. I think one of the issues here is that we do know, as we've talked today, the complexity of the circumstances, but despite the complexity, you know, these figures are unacceptable, and we have to work with a real energy to improve. We have been in discussion with our education colleagues. We have been assisting around the education and strategy in terms of attainment. The 3-year plan is currently in active implementation and taking forward. One of the issues I think that clearly concerns us here is just this low number of attainment. And whilst we know that from different factors that will have played a part, we do believe that together, working across education, social services departments, and also with our colleagues in CAMS and other professional fields supporting children and young people, we can make a difference. We have now got the National Strategic Group. This group, with key education partners and representation of social services, primary focus is to assist us in delivering the commitments in the education plan, sharing good practice, influencing national policy. Interestingly, the National Strategic Group has been instrumental in progressing pieces of work already, creating standard reporting template, presentation of the educational data for looked after children to corporate parenting panels, ensuring and shaping training modules, making a difference, a guide for designated persons for looked after children in schools. Piloting a new tracking system to better monitor educational progress of looked after children, and also shaping the new look personal education plan, which will also incorporate the individual development plan for children with additional learning needs. And it's really, I think, supplying, you know, good practice case studies, working together, education, social services, planning together for more innovative models. And again, there's an online community now of good practice in terms of being able to access. So it was absolutely critical for us to work together, and that work is certainly taking place.
My knowledge of this is only superficial, I admit that straight away, but my instinct would tell me that one of the biggest problems for children in these circumstances is the instability of their home life. They're moved around such a lot. The evidence we've received, it's very difficult for children in those circumstances to focus upon the education and making a success of the opportunities that they're presented with. And just to put another figure into the mix to back up what you were saying a moment ago, only 21% of looked after children achieved a level 2 threshold in 2017 compared with 67% of all pupils, so that's less than a third. And 41% of all pupils eligible for free school meals, so half of that. Only 12% of looked after children achieved level 2 threshold inclusive, compared with 55% of all pupils. So there's a huge gap there that needs to be addressed. What more can be done to try to avoid this, well, perhaps merry-go-round is entirely the wrong word to use in these circumstances, it's not very merry at all, of children moving from one carer to another, or in and out of institutions or whatever. If you're going to provide this stability, which should be the bedrock and foundation of better achievement.
And you are absolutely correct in relation to the instability. If there's placement instability, that creates educational instability. So it's using that knowledge that we currently have around placement stability, supporting the placement. We support the placement, that helps in terms of security, supporting education. But then it's using that good practice of the new models and working together with educationalists in terms of support. Actually, the fact that there's now much more proactive identification in terms of the needs of children and young people who are care experienced, to enable them within the education setting then to have their needs more bespoke, tailored to. Being sensitive. I think the learning of being sensitive, you have to have emotional resilience and to be able to learn. And it's using that in terms of awareness that there may be other things. So sharing information, good communication, good partnership, good planning to create that stability. And there's no doubt that although children come in sometimes with very difficult background and circumstances, that we can, if we work together, do much better. And the ministers, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and the Minister for Children and Social Care are meeting on the 9th of May, and Mr Melding will be part of that meeting as well, to discuss how we can further integrate our work in terms of the next 3 years.
I think it's building on the training of foster carers as well. They're really ensuring that they're going along to parents' evenings, they really understand the curricula, they're really properly trained to support children sometimes with very difficult needs, children that might be abused or have been neglected. I think it's working with the teachers themselves so they understand the particular needs of the children, because sometimes I don't think that's always understood. Because I think whilst I think you picked up earlier, whilst permanent exclusions are the same across the piece, the rates for fixed term is much, much higher. I think it's about 7 times, as you highlighted. And I think that there's a subgroup working on that as part of the Education National Strategic Group, and they're reporting in the summer. So I think that'll be key to look at good practice across Wales, because obviously that is not acceptable, and it's something that we really have to look into, the reasons behind that, and work as a piece across local authorities, education, and with foster carers.
Yeah. And allied to this, I'd like to ask a question about the People Development Grant. In England, it's much higher than it is in Wales, at 1,900 per child, compared with 1,150. I realise you can't comment on that, but in England also it is given for adopted as well as looked after children, whereas that's not the case in Wales. Has any thought been given, or is any thought being given to moving to a model closer to the English one?
Thank you very much for the question. What we have done in Wales is that we have allocated, the Cabinet Secretary for Education has allocated support looked after children, and you are correct, is based upon the calculation of the looked after children population. One of the criteria, however, and I think this is really important for the committee, the eligibility criteria since 2015 recognises that many adopted children will experience similar challenges, and therefore it does not mean that what it does mean is that funding can be used for children who are have been adopted and have come into the needs. So again, it is being made available for those children.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Lee Waters?
Yes.
Adopted children. The difference is in England, that's reflected in the formula, so they get additional money to compensate for the fact it's used for both looked after children and adopted children, whereas in Wales it's not. They're expected to fund even more people from the same amount of money. That's right, isn't it?
Well, without getting into the money question, because as officials with the political decisions, what we have certainly tried to do is make sure then that the criteria together is wider, which it is.
Sorry, this is not a political question. It's just a matter of fact. Is that not the case, that in England the funding formula reflects the fact it also applies to adopted children, but not here?
Yes, and but the criteria here does enable it to cover.
Sure, but there's just no funding for it. So they can spend it, but they won't get the extra funding for it.
but we're also supporting through other measures as well around adoption and adoption support. So there is actually funding being made available directly for adoption support. We do have third sector grant schemes that are currently in place as well within the Welsh context.
So you think in the round it's equivalent to England, is it?
Well, I wasn't, because we're not the officials responsible for the pupil development grant, so it's not that I'm trying to be evasive, but we don't lead on that policy side. From our discussions and working together, we know that it's clearly, what we have also done is make sure there's post-adoption support. So for children and young people who've been adopted and need that support, we're making sure then that through the National Adoption Service and the agencies.
I think to be fair to the officials, if pupil development grant isn't specifically within your remit, then you'd be...
This siloed working is precisely one of the points we're trying to get at.
Yes, but... and we can reflect that in our report, but at the same time, if they are not responsible for that grant, then they can't answer your question. I understand why
yes,
it's what
perhaps we can get us that information. The point I'm making in terms of what you are responsible for, if it's being spread thinner by allowing it to be able to spend on children in adoption, that's less money available for children who are looked after, which is your responsibility.
Yes, and what I am confident in is that the Cabinet Secretary has made monies available for the pupil development grant. That is wider in terms of children. We are also supporting it through other third sector schemes. So we have it's a wider picture in relation to make sure that we respond to those children's needs. So although the funding is in one place, a pupil development grant, there's other funding that we are clearly as a Welsh Government making available to support those children's needs.
Additional money was put in as part of the consequential funding, 125,000 for adoption support on top of the third sector grant money is already identified.
Right, it'd be useful, I think, perhaps a note for the committee to look in the round how that spending compares, please. Thank you.
Of course.
I'm aware that we're nearing the end of our time, and Adam Price, last but not least, has a couple of questions.
I just wanted to ask, the Improving Outcomes for Children Ministerial Advisory Group has now established a Sentinel Indicators Task and Finish Group. What are Sentinel indicators? How are they different to indicators?
I think they are effectively performance indicators. Effectively, some of the examples, obviously we're working through this, and this is a task and finish group that is being chaired by David Melding himself. I think an example would be the number of care leavers in education, training and employment, the number of children supported by edge of care, availability of housing options, workforce stability at practitioner level, which I think we picked up earlier, corporate parenting and participation, stability of placements, health indicators. So they are key performance measures. So the word sentinel there I wouldn't get too hung up on. I think it's really about key performance.
Yeah, can I gently suggest though maybe if they are just indicators, it might be worthwhile just calling them indicators.
I think that's very helpful. Something that we'll take on board.
I understand.
To be fair to David Melding, he did say previously that the title was a work in progress.
Yeah, it's not a original term, is it? I mean, it emerged. I think it's out of ecology or something like that. I mean, sentinel, species change and this kind of thing. But I think it's best wherever possible to avoid jargon, and I think there's a bit of complexity theory chucked in here as well. And certainly we don't want to go down that route. But so they're indicators. It's a year on from the establishment of the advisory group, and yet we're only now having the task and finish group to come up with the performance indicators. Why is it taking so long? I mean, if the Ministerial Advisory Group had its own performance indicators, probably would score quite poorly on that basis, wouldn't it?
I think part of the work of the group has been in establishing the sort of national framework, and as part of that, looking at the complexity, as I was trying to highlight earlier, because obviously you're looking at preventing children coming into care, you're looking at measures for children in care, and looking for care leavers. And I think most of these measures might be somewhere within government statistics and reporting. I think this was about bringing them together and looking about whether they were the right measures. I think always there's a concern that you just think about what is the number of looked after children, and has it gone up? And that is your measure of success or failure within Wales, and it's far more complicated than that. I think there is no right number. So part of this is about looking at those other measures in there to make sure that we have milestones in terms of the work of the group as we go forward to show that those things that we are introducing, those initiatives, those strategies are being successful, and longer term those numbers are coming down.
And again, finally, this is a general sort of public administration point really, but I mean, a ministerial advisory group is effectively a subgroup working underneath the minister, department officials. Now we've got another subgroup below the subgroup, effectively the task and finish group. I mean, doesn't this sort of tiering of decision making actually impede, agile, transparent, good governance? To use my own jargon there.
No, thank you very much. I would say I think it's a very complex arena, so it requires a layered approach. I think it's very difficult for us just in one meeting. So if you look at the minister's leading, the minister frequently meets with Mr. Melding as chair, goes through the work programme, goes through the critical issues, so it's very much taking that leadership role. The group itself, now I didn't come in today, and that's one of the things perhaps I should have done. I didn't count how many was around the table, but certainly in meetings I would say 30 to 40 participants in the main ministerial advisory group itself, because of the work and the complexity and the amount of work that's going on. So underneath that we do need work streams, and as part of that we will always try to balance that, but it's been quite important to take forward, and this was one that Mr. Melding himself was particularly keen to lead from the front on.
I think one of the great success factors of the Ministerial Advisory Group is that we have all the right people from across Wales in one room. They might number 30 to 40, as Albert said, but they're key players there. Sometimes those groups do get bigger and bigger, so we have tried to look at controlling those numbers. But under the 4 work streams now, we've got about 27 separate streams of work. This is highly complicated, but we're also keen to drive that work. And you will find within those groups various people who are both on the Ministerial Advisory Group or who not, we might want to second in, will be working to provide their expert knowledge. And I know the heads of children's services particularly value the work, and they chair, I think the majority, I think they chair all of the work streams. So it's really key that we've got the right people there, but it's also by that cross-representation, so we're getting all the ideas in to really drive progress in this area.
David Melding told us that it's, I think you're right, it's around 40 people. So he said sometimes it feels more like a conference than a group. But having it that size means that you've got that representation. That
I mean, the bit of complexity theory that I do remember is they call it getting the system in the room. I mean, I think that's a metaphor, but in your case, you're actually literally getting them in the room.
We literally have done that.
Right. Okay.
And may I just say, in terms of for completeness, I mean, actually the participants, the different partner organisations, they want to be in that room. And they want to contribute, so there's an ownership, which, I've been in many meetings over the years and many groups and many working groups, but this one is they bring a passion and a commitment to it that is exceptional to see.
We spoke earlier about cross-cutting working. Obviously we've got education, we've got health, we've got housing, we've got the judiciary, we've got CAFCAS, we've got the police commissioners, we've got wide spread of WLGA, health, and the third sector. So already you can see how it would grow then with probation and all manner of things, because the tie in with youth justice. And so it is a complex arena, but we feel by being cross-cutting and involving all these representatives, we're really driving both sort of rich conversations in there, but also making sure that what we're putting in place is going to be fit for the future and is involving the right people, so we're not having to duplicate. So the advice we give to Minister then is very considered.
And so in these areas which are cross-sectoral and intergenerational sometimes in terms of the scale of ambition, then this kind of approach, and presumably cross-party as well, because no matter who's in power is going to be there as a factor. Okay, on that. So they work in those specific areas quite well.
Rhiannon Passmore?
Thank you.
This group, we've talked to the chair earlier on today. One of the questions that I asked was, how is this information, and it's very valuable that you have this forum, absolutely convinced about that. How is that disseminated and distilled down so that there is a direction of advice to the minister, so that it is a fit-for-purpose body? Because, as I said earlier, it's very easy to set up advisory groups and boards. It's what comes out of the end of that sausage machine. Because, as I've also said today, I can go and talk to any number of people in the field of looked after children, and they will say, we need X, we need Y, we need Z, and they will give you a menu, and I won't go through the points that we talked about earlier, of what they think needs to happen. So bearing in mind the cuts that have come into Wales and the stringent conditions that local authorities are working to, do you feel that this ministerial board is now ready to report on these work streams? Because there does seem to be a need for more urgency and pace in terms of some of the issues that local government and social services heads are facing in this arena.
I think the first thing to say is, the pace and energy is really quite crucial to this, because the work, as any formation of a new group, takes time to build. The first phase really looked at the whole relationship and independent reviewing office, etc. We're now in phase 2. There is an absolute clear framework in terms of the actions that are required. That's in place. I think the formal publication of that is due to happen, but the work programme is there for the minister. The minister is in agreement with that work programme, has actually commenced that. Some of the work streams will take us probably more time than others. I think there may be areas where we can go out quicker. The ones around prevention, early intervention, the models. We've done major piece of work around models of care, and we've come up, and what we've had back in is that there are lots of different models of care, and some of those models of care seem to be effective, some less effective. I was reading around the North Yorkshire model, as the member raised around other different models, and again they've introduced models that have produced reductions in costs but improved outcomes. So again, it's looking at what's going to work within a Welsh context, and so that work is certainly committed to and in progress, and I think over the imminent future we'll be able to come back to this committee and report that particular progress.
Right. And it's not all jam tomorrow. There are things actively. For example, in June we've got the publication of the National Practice Standards for independent reviewing officers and independent visitors. We've got the new regulations and code and practice on special guardianship orders. We've got the publication of Bright Spots, which is reported to care experiences of looked after children, and we've got the national framework. So just to give you a cut of the next 4 weeks, there's 4 major pieces of work that are being delivered.
And the national framework, I do think is, I think it's a commendable piece of work that's been done. I think it will lead to significant changes in the way we approach fostering and fostering support in Wales.
Oscar, very briefly.
Thank you very much. When is the Welsh government going to launch its all-year brand for fostering? And does the Welsh government believe that the branding offers value for money to children in care?
All the branding in terms of the national framework will be out in the summer, so that is very soon in terms of marketing, also in terms of training. So all of these things are very imminent. As you know, we're in the implementation stage, and that's over the next 2 to 3 years. So we're right in the heart now of delivering that. We've just delivered the commissioning guidance that has gone out also to local authorities, and they're working up their plans for June. So all this is coming together in the summer.
Okay, very good. Thank you to our witnesses. That's great. We are just 3 minutes over, so got a lot of information there. We'll send you a transcript of today's proceedings before it's finalised, just so you can check for accuracy. But Alistair Davey, Albert Heaney, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Our ultimate evidence session, I think, on this part 1.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I propose in accordance with Standing Order 7.42 to meet in private for items 7 and 8. All happy? Yeah, no happy.